Arise News analyst, who is going to mention some of the headlines in the newspapers and then join us to focus a little bit more on the passing of former Zimbabwe President Robert Mugabe, who has died at the age of 95. Mr. Mugabe was toppled in a palace coup by top generals in the country's army in 2017, once boasted that he would rule the Southern African country until he was 100 years old. The following package is on the life and times of Mr. Robert Mugabe.
A hero in the fight against white minority rule and a legend even in the West. In office, he was credited with education reforms and forcing reconciliation between blacks and whites. But even then, Mugabe's reputation for repression had begun.
For the first few years, I think you have to say that Mugabe was a very wise leader. There were some major catastrophes, particularly by the use of too much force to put down what he thought was rebellion in the west side of the country. But really, for the first 10, perhaps even 15 years, Mugabe led the country very, very well.
Mugabe's efforts at reconciliation faded quickly, epitomized by the seizure of white-owned farms. Introduced in 2000, this radical policy was used to reward his own supporters, few of whom knew much about farming. The result was famine in a country once known as the breadbasket of Africa. Yet Mugabe would go on to win elections several times, ignoring each international outcry that followed the widespread use of violence to intimidate his opponents. As he entered his 90s, he lost none of his disdain for political enemies.
We will fight the white man. We will fight until the last of us falls, naked, with nothing.
Mugabe continued to enjoy popularity with his party and to win elections. Though in 2008, polls were marked by violence against the opposition, and the 2012 vote was likely rigged. Having become the world's oldest president, he was finally forced to relinquish power on the 21st of November 2017, dropped by his party, the army, and the people. When he died, after 37 years of undivided rule, Zimbabwe still had not recovered from the economic collapse that ravaged the country.
Well, Emmanuel Efeni, Robert Mugabe there, mixed legacy, different points of view. I see that some commentators, they go by the maxim that you do not speak ill of the dead. But I think that there is need for objectivity, in assessing the legacy of Mugabe. We had made some comments before you came, but, what's your own take?
Well, Robert Mugabe, classic freedom fighter, nationalist, became prime minister, later president, and of course started well, but in the course of time, wouldn't say he outlived his usefulness, but clearly he did not know when to go. And perhaps more damning is that he did not put in place the structure, political structure, after himself. Hence, he had that ignominy of being booted out of office, albeit with some dignity, because the soldiers who booted him out were his henchmen, and his successor was his right-hand man at the time,
Emerson Mnangagwa. But that was his political structure.
Yes.
That was his structure that booted him out.
His political structure booted him out. But perhaps he could have gone out in a more dignified way. But he wanted to cling to power till death, perhaps die in office. If there is one positive I think Zimbabweans should take out of his death, is that he did not die in office. Because if he had died in office without being moved out the way he was done in 2017, perhaps we should have been thinking of perhaps a political crisis in Zimbabwe now. But clearly, it was out of the political equation when he passed away early this morning. For Mugabe, much can be said about him, but many will not forget that the economy, once the most promising economy in the African continent, the food basket of the continent, under his watch became an economy that was beggarly, to say the least. And that is perhaps where his legacy has this negative touch, because under him, Zimbabwe economy was almost in ruins.
What do you think of the circumstances of his exit? I mean, you've made the point that, you know, the military pushed him out. But how about the Jezebel problem that he had, you know, particularly considering the fact that his wife, Grace Mugabe, became too powerful? I mean, a typist turned, you know, the other room, queen. And then she wanted to seize power. She was making moves to succeed her husband, you know, to create a kind of a dynasty. What's your comment on that?
Yes, Mrs. Grace Mugabe, nothing wrong with being ambitious. Wife of a very weak, old, almost senile president. He saw an opportunity and was angling to take over. You call her typist. To be a typist, you must be quite...
No, I didn't say that necessarily in a derogatory manner.
Because
that was factual.
I don't want to mention countries. Of course, you know, where less than school certificate is a qualification to become a president. For you to be a typist, you must have attained a school certificate. So not her qualification, but the fact that she was close to the president, a dictator. And it was as if she could worm her way to the presidency from the other room, as it were, into the seat of power. But the people of Zimbabwe knew better. And I'm sure, I want to believe that what also incentivized the coup that removed Mugabe from office was the prospect of his wife easing herself into power.
Absolutely.
And that was what also moved his lieutenants in the army and the politicians to ensure that they eased out.
That Mnangagwa was sort of a proxy. He was the vice president, and he would have stepped down for disgrace Mugabe to become president of of Zimbabwe, and that was just too much. They couldn't countenance that possibility.
But you see, I mean, this is an open question for all of us. I mean, you saw that footage on Mugabe saying, "We will fight the white man." Will you consider Mugabe a racist?
Oh, absolutely.
Along the same line as, say, Idi Amin, you know, former President Idi Amin of Uganda. Because he seems to have promoted a lot of hate, a lot of xenophobia.
The only white man you can trust is a dead white man. He has absolute unapologetic
For me,
racism.
I wouldn't consider Mugabe a racist.
Really?
The white man there was a metaphor for oppressor. The white man there was a metaphor for the colonizers, who must also be pushed out. And it's not, you cannot equate that to a classic case of racism.
I kind of agree.
I disagree. Let me tell you why I disagree. Because racism for me is not about hatred. That's prejudice. Racism requires institutional action.
That's true.
So the power in Zimbabwe was black power. It was actually not black power. It was Robert Mugabe was personified. He's the power. And he went out of his way to attack whites in his country. That is textbook racism. That's beyond prejudice. But Mandela eased out the white control, did he not? Without bloodletting, without that kind of rhetoric. He was an absolute racist.
Well, and in any case, let me add this to it. Many of those white Zimbabweans, you know, whose lands were taken, who were pushed out of the country, many of them, most of them, in fact, had never known any other country.
That's their home.
They were born and raised
Yes.
in Rhodesia.
Yes.
And they also became Zimbabweans, you know. And in the same manner in which he descended on the Indebele ethnic group, you know, you find him again almost doing the same thing, using another strategy, you know, descending on the white population in Zimbabwe.
Well, if you look at where the country also was coming from at that time, having been under white rule over time, it only makes sense that when you are revolting or you are now resisting, you have to be resisting white rule.
No, but can I say you can resist without hatred. Because when he first assumed power in 1980 through ZANU-PF, his first policy was racial reconciliation.
Yes.
After a while, he changed. So there was, for 7 years, it was racial reconciliation, the first 7 years of his almost 40 years. So really, racism is never necessary. It's ugly and it's toxic.
But he was also in a hurry to correct the wrong of colonialism. Perhaps he took it to the extreme, hence this racist tint to it.
When the first 7 years that you're in the saddle, you're not in a hurry, all of a sudden the hurry kicks in. I don't understand that.
Yes, you see.
The man was a racist.
You see,
There's no excuse for racism.
For instance, South Africa acted with the benefit of hindsight. The Mandelas.
I think South Africa was just lucky to have Nelson Mandela.
Yes.
No,
he was a unique person.
Because Nelson Mandela,
That's someone I
he had a different kind of heart.
Yes.
Robert Mugabe, no matter what positive things we may say about him, has become one of those poster guys for setitism, for tyranny
for complete
in
and utter
Africa.
evil.
And you still have some of them, around. You have in Guinea Equatorial, you have Teodoro Obiang, and you have also in, Zimbabwe. I don't think Emerson Mnangagwa himself, the way he's been praising Mugabe, will be in a hurry to leave, So you have all these, tyrants all over the place. You have in Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, and we have seen a pattern of persons who stay in office, who change the constitution, who say they are irreplaceable, who say that without them, the country cannot go forward.
Who practice evil.
So Mugabe's passing, his exit from office, his eventual death is an indication that nobody can live forever, nobody can rule forever. And this is the old thing about Percy Shelley's Ozymandias. Every
I love that
every
poem.
big man, every this thing,
love that
everything will come to an end someday.
Yes,
That's
see
the
me
moral
and
of it.
tremble,
So I think
and all that says dust.
For others, he tightly does. It's a lesson that plan your exits from
Well,
power.
Efeni, let's take a short break, and then when we return, we'll take a look at today's newspapers from around the world. Stay tuned. Well, welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Well, Emmanuel Efeni, I know you are itching to go through the headlines, but we have on standby in our London studio, Thamsanqa Zhou, who is, an Arise News correspondent and who has connections with Zimbabwe, and is going to give us his own perspective on the passing of former President Robert Mugabe. Thamsanqa, good to have you on the morning show. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning.
To
Yes,
you, Reuben, Laila, and Tundun, and Emmanuel.
yes, thank you.
It is one of those days where it's difficult to say it's a sad day for people, because Mugabe was such a character during the course of his long time in leadership that he divided opinion in the south and southwest of the country, where there are a lot of victims. Those things, even, of course, there's also new administration with people that actually at one point were running away with their lives because of what was going on at the time and in the recent past in 2017, when former President Mugabe was forced out of power. So it is a difficult time. But Reuben, maybe just to correct something, one perception from what I've heard and what some people have been saying before. Robert Mugabe was not a racist at all. He never targeted people. He in fact was the one African leader who protected the former Rhodesians and all those farm workers for the first years of his administration, and he was only it was only after he fell out with the Labour government under Tony Blair in 1997, 98, going to 2000, that he became anti-West, but not. It would be incorrect to describe him as somebody who was racist, who targeted white people. In actual fact, the majority of his friends are white, and there are a lot of Zimbabweans who are white who stayed with the land that they had from before. So I think that it is important to correct that. But his legacy is mixed. He did good things for education, for part of the country, health and all that. But there are people who say he should have been given an opportunity to explain some of his actions that cost a lot of lives in the country.
Thank you for that contradictory perspective, but I'm sure you don't begrudge me my right to an opinion. My definition of racism is quite strict. For you, a person to say that the only white man you can trust is a dead white man, imagine the outrage if a white leader said something similar. And it's from the typical racist playbook. Oh, I have black friends, I have white friends. It does not detract from, well, my personal definition.
I was actually looking up the definition when he said that, just to get it. And what you said is what stands. And it goes back to the point of whether prejudice too. Because there is a thin line there, I do kind of understand. But there's kind of a clear stance that Mugabe used to take towards how he felt towards white people that could, by definition, count as racism, or does, by definition, count as racism.
But Tam, do you have any information about the mood in Zimbabwe at the moment among the people, considering the fact that, you know, when President Mugabe was pushed out, there was some kind of jubilation on the streets. The people of Zimbabwe receiving the news of his transition. Do you have any information?
Okay, so to start with the last one, Reuben, the mood appears to be mixed. There are people who are close to him who are mourning his death, but the news was just filtering once the President Mnangagwa confirmed that indeed he had passed on. Then there's going to be a process of bringing his body and then starting the funeral and all that. So that will be a state-led exercise, and we are likely to see a lot of people coming there. The people in the south, in the main, those that were victims of some of the worst atrocities in the country, are saying that they don't want to talk about his death at the moment because they were never given answers. And most of them that I've been talking to say they don't know whether to celebrate or to be sad that the very person who had answers to the questions that they had. Some of them grew up without parents or never knew their parents, who'd either disappeared or were killed in their eyes at tender age. So it becomes a very mixed bag within the country. And you would see that the bulk of the reaction has been from outside the country rather than from within, because it's been almost 2 years now since he left power, and he had basically been quiet. People knew he had been in Singapore, he was unwell, the state was paying for his medical bills, and so and he was 95. So it's not something that came as a surprise that he has passed on. But when you talk about his legacy, everyone that discusses his legacy, they talk about a different Robert Mugabe throughout the generations, from the 60s when he was fighting, and the 70s and the 80s when he came in with the reconciliation aspect and the Gukura Hundi, and then the 90s, and then the economy tanking afterwards when he was now fighting with the West. It continues to be a mixed bag, and that is reflected by the mood. And of course, Tundu, everyone, you are right in the observations that you were making. I was just saying that having been on the ground, having worked within Zimbabwe, I became a journalist as a young man, probably because of what Robert Mugabe was doing, and I thought that narrative was important. His policies were never policies that targeted whites within the country. And even when he continued, he wanted to be close to the West as much as possible, but he had that anger. The land question was he was following rather than leading it, because the people that had fought in the war wanted him to get out of power, decided to take the farms themselves, and then all the government did at the time was to say to Tony Blair, we are not going to actively use the security forces to remove those people from the farm. So there's a misnomer that Robert Mugabe led the land revolution in Zimbabwe that cost Zimbabwe's relationship with the West. His government followed, because all people did was to go to the Ministry of Agriculture and the ones responsible for deeds and say, I have now taken back my grandfather's farm, my parents' farm, and it is now in my hands. It was never the other way around. But of course, it is the way it is. And I think it's a good discussion, because what we see is a reflection of different people having a different view of Robert Mugabe at different stages.
If I may ask this question, something that came up in the course of our discussions. Zimbabwe after Mugabe, what should we expect? Or you don't see, you think that that era is past and gone, and that Zimbabwe will be well and fine after Mugabe? I asked that question because his shadow still hovered around for as long as he lived, even if he had left government since 2017.
Well, just a quick one. Zimbabwe after Mugabe, it all depends on whether the sanctions are lifted or not. It's so difficult for any country under economic sanctions to succeed. The government that is in place now, you have a Minister of Finance who is trying everything under the book to get things right, but it's so difficult. The economy is on the floor. I know you can't fall off the floor, but there are so many things that need to be put in place. Healthcare has crumbled, education, almost everything that was in place has crumbled over the last 2 decades. And putting that back together requires a lot of effort, a lot of money, but that can't happen as long as Zimbabwe is under sanctions, and also having part of the internal process where the opposition are doing something that they say, jecha, where they say they will pour like sand inside any food that the government provides to the people, in a literal sense. So it depends on the economic sanctions, but it also depends on the internal political structures, whether people can work together as a nation or not.
Tam, for your nuanced perspectives, very valuable. But I wanted to ask you, you were saying that it's not, unfortunately, we've run out of time and I can't ask my question, but thank you so much for joining us and sharing all this information.
Thank you very much, Tham. So that was Thamsanqa from London studio. Well, Efeni, looks like the big story today is the passing
Mugabe
of Robert
release.
Mugabe.
It's Mugabe.
Well, thank
Anyway,
you, Mr.
thank you very
Efeni,
much,
for
Efeni.
joining us.
Thank you.
That's all on this segment of the morning show. We'll take a short break now. When the morning show returns, Adeswa, Rufai, and Shaitan will be here to take you through the rest of the show. Stay with us.